The town whispered her name like a curse. From the wooden porches of the saloon to the dusty steps of the general store, people pointed and muttered. They called her a sinner, a troublemaker, a woman who had let the world see her in ways it wasn't meant to. She had been a widow for more than a year, her husband taken by the river that ran too swift and too cold for a man to survive. Since then, the town had filled its empty hours with gossip, turning her every act into a scandal and every glance into proof of sin. She had learned to move through the streets with her head low, hands busy with chores, eyes steady on the ground, but the judgment followed her like a shadow that never left. Her small house sat at the edge of the prairie, far enough from the nearest neighbors that they could not see her every move, yet close enough for them to throw their suspicions over the fence like stones. Inside, the air smelled of dust and burned wood, and the walls held the silence of someone used to being alone. She had grown accustomed to it, to the quiet, to the solitude, and even to the sting of the town's scorn. Each morning she worked her fields, fed the few animals she kept, and tended to her small garden, all while the whispers crept through the town like a persistent wind. It was a life of survival, and she had become skilled at keeping herself invisible, though every insult and stare had left a mark she could not erase. Then came the day the rider appeared. He came over the horizon with the wind at his back, dust kicking up from his horse's hooves, and a look in his eyes that belonged to a world far beyond the prairie. He was not like the other men in town, the ones with whiskey breath and lazy smiles who pretended strength, but faltered at the first sign of danger. No, this man carried the calm and the fire of someone who had walked 1,000 miles in silence, and his presence was immediate and undeniable. The townspeople noticed first, their murmurs rising as they watched him pull into the stable with the kind of confidence that demanded attention. He was tall, strong, and unyielding, with dark hair that fell in a way that seemed untamed and eyes that could pierce through a person without a word. The widow noticed him too. At first, she tried to look away, to pretend he was just another stranger passing through. But there was something in the way he moved, deliberate and quiet, that made her heart tighten in ways it hadn't for a long time. She saw him at the edge of the town, standing by the river that had taken her husband, as if he understood the place before she did. His horse pawed at the ground, restless, and his hands rested easily on the leather straps across his chest, like he belonged wherever he stood. It was not long before he noticed her, standing on her porch with a basket of laundry in her hands, and their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the town's whispers and judging glances faded, leaving only a raw, unspoken recognition between two people from different worlds. He was an Apache warrior, and the stories about his people had traveled like wildfire across the plains. The settlers spoke of their bravery, their skill with horses, their fierce protection of what was theirs. Some told tales of savagery, but she knew better than to trust every rumor carried by the wind. Still, his presence stirred something unfamiliar and dangerous inside her, a mixture of fear, curiosity, and longing that she could not deny. The town had branded her as corrupt, but this man's gaze seemed to see through it all to something honest, something real beneath the surface. It made her pulse quicken and her hands tremble in ways she had thought the years had washed away. The first evening he approached her, the sun dropping low behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of fire, she had a choice to make. The town would not forgive her attention to a stranger, especially one whose people were feared, but she felt a pull she could not resist. He spoke with a voice low and steady, words that carried both weight and respect. He asked nothing of her at first, merely offered a presence that felt safe yet thrilling, a strange protection she hadn't known she needed. She offered him water, simple hospitality, and he accepted it with a quiet nod, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no rush, no demand, only the awareness of one person seeing another clearly, past the lies, past the rumors, past the town's relentless judgment. Days passed and he remained near, moving with the rhythm of the land rather than the rigid rules of the town. He rode his horse along the hills, sometimes disappearing for hours, sometimes returning to speak in a soft, deliberate way. The widow felt herself drawn to him, to the way he carried both strength and silence like a shield. She began to leave food on her porch, simple meals prepared with care, and he never took more than he needed, never lingered in ways that would cause scandal. Yet the town watched, and the whispers grew louder, sharper, and crueler. They had labeled her already, and now her association with a man so unlike them only fed their hunger for gossip. The widow did not care for the town anymore. Their voices were nothing compared to the quiet understanding that began to grow between her and the warrior. He had stories he did not tell, scars she could not see, but in his presence, she felt something awaken, a sense of being seen, of being chosen, in a world that had made her invisible. He treated her with respect, spoke to her as if she were worthy of attention and thought, and she responded in kind, her curiosity about him deepening with every word, every gesture. There was danger in it. Yes, danger she could not deny, but also a possibility she had not allowed herself to consider for many long months. One night, under a sky filled with stars so sharp and close they seemed to hum, the warrior came to her doorstep again. The wind carried the scent of sage and earth, and he spoke of the land as if it belonged to him, as if he understood its secrets in ways she never could. He asked her to listen, not just with her ears but with her heart, and for the first time in years she felt herself opening. She told him about her husband, about the town, about the loneliness that had settled in her bones. And though he did not respond with words of comfort, his presence alone was enough. The town might call her a sinner, a widow, a woman undeserving of love or respect, but here, in the quiet of the night, she found something different: recognition, connection, and a strange kind of safety. Rumors swirled like leaves in a storm. People watched her windows with suspicion and whispered to one another behind doors. The preacher shook his head in disapproval, the shopkeepers muttered under their breath, and the children laughed cruelly as they passed by her fence. They did not see the truth of her heart, the fear and hope battling inside her. They could not understand the way the warrior's gaze made her pulse skip, nor could they feel the way her hand shook when he drew near. They only knew what they wanted to know, and the town thrived on stories of shame and sin, but the widow had learned to care for those voices as little as she cared for the dust on her porch. She knew the world outside the walls of her house was dangerous, and he was dangerous too, though not in the ways the town imagined. There was a strength in him that could protect and destroy, and he carried the pride of his people like a shield. She felt that strength when he touched her hand briefly, when he spoke in tones that were soft but unwavering, when he rode near and waited for her glance before he moved on. It was a connection that frightened her as much as it thrilled her, and she found herself watching for him each day, listening for the sound of hooves on the dry ground, feeling her heart lift and tighten all at once. But danger was never far. The town's scorn and suspicion could not harm her, not really, yet there were forces beyond the town, forces in the wide-open plains and in the lands his people defended that would test both her courage and the loyalty of the warrior who had chosen her. She felt it in the wind before storms, in the distant cries of animals, in the way the horizon seemed to shimmer with secrets she could not name. Every quiet moment carried the weight of what was to come, and every glance from the warrior reminded her that life could change in the blink of an eye. One afternoon, as she tended to her small garden, she felt a presence behind her, the air shifting with the soft pressure of someone standing close. She turned slowly, expecting nothing more than the quiet of the prairie, and found him there, waiting as if he had never left. His eyes held questions she could not answer, and yet the certainty of his purpose was clear. He came not with demands or words, but with the weight of choice pressing down like the summer sun. And in that instant, she understood that life had offered her a chance at something different, something neither whispered gossip nor fear could touch. She did not know what it would cost, nor did she know what she could give in return, but the pull between them was undeniable. The town would talk. They would continue to call her names, to mock her courage and her choices. They could not see the way she had learned to stand taller with him nearby, nor could they feel the stirring of hope she had not dared to embrace. She would face their judgment, yes, but the path before her was no longer dictated by whispers. It was shaped by the quiet, steady hands of a warrior who had chosen her, not the scandal, not the shame, not the town, but her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the prairie, she stood on her porch and watched him ride toward her, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. Her heart raced, her breath caught, and a question lingered in the air. What would happen now, with a widow and a warrior caught between a world of judgment and a world that had never truly known her? She did not know, but she felt it in her bones. Nothing would ever be the same again. The town held its breath, the prairie waited in silence, and somewhere deep inside she felt the first flicker of a life that belonged to her and to the man who had chosen her. The night pressed down heavy and quiet, broken only by the distant calls of coyotes and the soft shuffle of the wind through the tall grasses. She could still feel the echo of his presence, the way his shadow lingered long after he had ridden away. It was not fear that gripped her, but a strange kind of awareness, like the prairie itself had shifted in response to him. Her hands shook slightly as she wiped them on her apron, the simple task of tending the garden now feeling heavier than usual. She had lived in this place for years, surviving loss, whispers, and the hard edge of loneliness, yet everything seemed different with him in her life, as if a door had opened she had long forgotten existed. Memories pressed against her mind, unbidden and sharp. She thought of her husband, a man gentle but taken too soon by the river that ran through the valley beyond town. His death had left a quiet hole in her life, one that the town had filled with their gossip and assumptions. The people had painted her as weak, careless, and open to temptation, and over time she had learned to keep to herself, to work her land, and to let their words fall away like dust. She had mastered the art of invisibility, wearing her grief as a shield, until now. Now she found herself thinking of him, the Apache warrior, and wondering at the life he had come from, the struggles he had survived, and the reasons that had brought him here, to her doorstep. She did not know the full story of his people, though she had heard whispers in town and along the trails from travelers passing through. The Apache had been warriors for generations, living free on the land, moving swiftly and silently, defending what was theirs with unyielding skill. Some settlers feared them, speaking of raids and conflict, of lives lost and villages burned. Others admired their courage from a distance, though few dared approach. She had no fear of their legends now, only curiosity. She wanted to know what had brought this man so far from his people, what battles he had fought, what losses he had endured. There was a weight in his gaze that hinted at stories she could not yet grasp. Days passed in a rhythm that felt both ordinary and charged with tension. She continued her work, tending her house and garden, feeding the animals, all while the town's gossip swirled like a storm outside her fences. She saw them glance at her with suspicion, heard their soft mutters as they passed by, and felt the sting of judgment as if it were a physical weight. Yet she no longer let it dictate her every movement. The warrior's presence had awakened something dormant in her, a sense of strength she had thought lost, a readiness to face what the world had to say. She moved differently now, with a quiet vigilance, her mind alert to shadows, to sounds, to signs she had once ignored. The first time he returned after that evening under the stars, it was at dawn. She had been drawing water from the well, the cold liquid running into the bucket as her thoughts wandered, when she noticed him standing at the edge of the field. He did not speak immediately, only watched, his dark eyes steady on her. The horse shifted under him, snorting softly, and she realized she was holding her breath. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but deliberate, asking her about the land, about the animals, about the tasks that filled her days. There was no small talk, no attempt at charm, only direct questions and observations that carried a respect for her life and her work. She answered cautiously at first, then with more ease, recognizing that he meant no harm. Over time, they began to exchange more than words. He shared fragments of his past, small stories of the plains, of the lessons his people had taught him about survival, honor, and strength. He spoke of battles fought, of allies lost, of nights under open skies that stretched endlessly with danger and beauty. She listened, fascinated and cautious, sensing both the truth and the pain in his words. It was not an easy story, nor one meant to impress or beg forgiveness. It was life, raw and unvarnished, and she found herself drawn into it, pulled closer by the honesty that could not be hidden. There were nights she thought of the town and its relentless judgment, and she wondered what would happen if they discovered her growing connection with him. They would not understand, could not see past their narrow views of right and wrong, and the thought made her heart tighten. Yet, for the first time in years, she felt alive, awake to possibilities she had not dared consider. She had been a widow, a figure of scandal in their eyes, but with him, she was a woman capable of choices that mattered, choices that could shape the life she had thought forever lost. He too had his burdens. Sometimes she noticed him staring into the distance for hours, eyes fixed on horizons she could not see, lips pressed into a line of concentration or remembrance. He carried the air of a man who had been through trials that left no visible scars but weighed on the spirit. She wanted to ask him, to understand, but something held her back. She knew the truth of his experiences could not be unpacked easily, and she sensed he would share only when he was ready. For now, there was a rhythm to their silence, a conversation in glances and gestures, in the simple acts of feeding a horse or tending a garden, in the quiet understanding that grew between them. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the horizon burned with gold and crimson, he rode into her yard without a word, dismounting with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime on horseback. She met him at the porch, basket of food in hand, and noticed the faint dust on his boots, the trace of a journey untold. He did not reach for her hand, did not speak of the future, but the way he looked at her carried weight she could feel in her chest. The town would have seen scandal, but she saw choice, recognition, and the strange, quiet promise of protection. As the days turned into weeks, her curiosity about him deepened. She learned small details, how he moved quietly through the land, how he seemed attuned to the weather, the animals, the subtle shifts of the prairie. He was patient and deliberate, never imposing, yet always present, as if he belonged where he stood. She began to see strength not just in his body but in his mind, in the way he observed, calculated, and acted. It was a power that demanded respect, one that neither bowed to the town's narrow rules nor the prejudices of strangers. She also saw the danger that came with it. His people, his past, and the unknown elements of the plains beyond the town were a constant shadow over their connection. Rumors of raids, of conflicts between settlers and the Apache, of dangers that lurked in the open land reminded her that their bond was fragile. The town could not touch the warrior, but it could still manipulate the story, twist the truth, and use fear to control perception. And beyond that, the world outside the fences was wild, unpredictable, and sometimes merciless. She had survived grief and loneliness, but this felt different. This was alive, unpredictable, and urgent. One afternoon, she found him near the river that had claimed her husband. He stood silently, watching the water move with patient attention, and she felt a shiver of memory and fear. The river had been cruel, but he seemed unafraid, understanding something she never had. She approached slowly, careful not to startle him, and he acknowledged her with a nod. She realized then that he had not come merely for curiosity or passing interest. He understood loss and he understood courage. His presence near that river was a statement, a quiet acknowledgement that some wounds could be confronted and some fears could be faced, even if the town and its whispers would never comprehend. Evenings grew colder. the prairie stretching long and empty under stars sharper than knives. She would sit by her window, listening for the sound of hooves on the dry ground, feeling a tension in her chest she could not name. Every shadow, every rustle in the grass felt amplified, and she knew the world was shifting around her. The town's whispers still reached her, the judgments still cut, but they had lost power. She had learned to focus on what mattered, on what was real. The warrior was real. His presence was real. The possibilities between them were real, and they carried a weight neither rumor nor fear could deny. Yet uncertainty remained. She did not know what he sought, what dangers lay beyond the horizon, or how their lives might intertwine. Every day was a balance between hope and caution, desire and restraint. She understood the stakes were high, that connection with him could bring joy or peril, and she felt the thrill and the fear in equal measure. The town would not forgive, the land would not yield its secrets easily, and the past would not let go. She had survived alone, but with him, the future felt unpredictable, like a river rushing over unseen rocks, both dangerous and necessary. She did not know what the next day would bring, only that her life had changed, that she had been chosen, and that something larger than gossip, larger than grief, was at play. She felt the pull of possibility, the weight of tension, the stirrings of a story that had only begun. And as the wind whispered through the prairie, carrying the distant cries of animals and the faint sound of hooves, she understood that the world had shifted forever and there was no turning back. The night waited, patient and dark, as she stood at her door, looking out over the land she had always called home, and listened for the sound of him returning. Somewhere in the distance, he rode with purpose she could not yet see, and she felt a pulse of anticipation and dread. Life had given her a new path, one filled with uncertainty, connection, and danger, and she could only stand and watch as it unfolded. The town would judge, the land would test, and her own heart would decide what came next. But one thing was clear: her life, her choices, and her future were no longer hers alone to control, and the Apache warrior who had chosen her would change everything. The stars stretched over the prairie like silent witnesses, and she waited, heart tight and mind alert, for the next moment, the next movement, the next choice that would decide what came next in a life that had only just begun to stir with possibility. The horizon seemed endless, and the night whispered secrets she could not yet understand. And somewhere, riding swiftly through the darkness, he was coming, bringing with him a presence that would test her courage, her judgment, and her understanding of love, trust, and destiny. The prairie was restless that morning, the wind shifting across the tall grasses with a sense of warning. She moved through her small yard, hands busy with chores, but her thoughts kept returning to him. The Apache warrior had not been near since the night before, and the empty space left by his absence felt heavier than the house itself. She tried to focus on feeding the animals, checking fences, repairing the wheelbarrow. Yet each sound in the distance made her pause, hooves striking the ground, the flap of wings, the rattle of a distant wagon. Every instinct whispered that something was coming, though she could not name it. The town, as always, was a constant background to her life, but now its murmurs carried sharper tones. The saloon doors opened with the creak of gossip spilling out into the street. The men leaned on the posts, tipping hats with fake politeness while their eyes measured and judged. The women spoke in quiet tones, hands folded over aprons, voices carrying half-truths meant to wound. They had noticed the warrior, of course, and the speculation had only grown more cruel, more insistent. It was not enough that she had survived widowhood, worked her land, and kept herself upright. Now they feared what they did not understand. Some called him a threat, others whispered that she had lost her mind. All agreed, in one way or another, that nothing good could come of this. She knew their voices could not reach her, not really, but she felt their tension in the air like static before a storm. She heard the knock at her door before seeing who stood there, and the familiar figure of the town sheriff, filled the doorway. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had grown hard from years of enforcing order, or at least what the town called order. His eyes swept over her, lingering just long enough to measure, and his voice carried the weight of authority when he spoke. "You've been seen," he said simply, without preamble, as if that were enough accusation. "With him." Her stomach tightened, and she forced her voice steady. "And if I have?" The sheriff's brow furrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You know what the town will say. You know what trouble follows in his wake. You've survived alone so far, but this is different." "I can handle it," she replied, her gaze unflinching. She had spent too long listening to whispers, letting them shape her life. Now she would not. Still, the tension in the air was undeniable, and even as she spoke, she felt the weight of the conflict stretching before her, a life intertwined with a man the town feared, a future shaped by forces she could not control, and the constant pull of danger lurking beyond the horizon. Meanwhile, he rode silently along the ridge beyond her home, observing the town from a distance. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke and livestock, the sound of voices and the creak of wagons, all mingled with the rhythm of his horse's steps. He understood the delicate balance at play, the dangers that lurked in both the town and the open plains. His people had taught him to read every movement, to notice the subtlest signs of intent, to anticipate danger before it arrived. And now he sensed the tension building, not just in her life, but in the way the town had begun to react. Whispers and suspicion were one thing, but fear could turn quickly into action, and he knew he could not allow her to be caught in the storm unprepared. Inside her house, she moved carefully, arranging her chores with deliberate attention. Yet her mind was on him and on the subtle signals she had learned to read, the footprints in the dust, the way the wind carried certain scents, the way the horizon seemed to shimmer with possibilities she could neither predict nor control. She thought of her husband, of the life she had known before loss and judgment had marked her. She thought of her neighbors and their relentless eyes. And she thought of the warrior, of the quiet strength he carried, the mystery that clung to him, and the way he had chosen her despite everything. The day stretched on, long and unyielding, and the tension in the town began to shift. A new rider appeared at the edge of the street, a man who carried letters and rumors in equal measure. He was known for delivering news that unsettled even the most grounded townsfolk, and today he brought word of conflicts beyond the settlement. Stories of Apache raids far to the west, of disputes among settlers, and of dangers that moved silently across the plains. His arrival stirred the town, and soon the whispers about her and the warrior took on new tones. It was no longer just scandal or gossip. Now fear had entered the conversation, and with it, the weight of uncertainty pressed heavier on her chest. She moved to the window, watching the rider disappear down the main street, and felt a shiver run through her. The land itself seemed restless, the tall grasses bending under a wind that carried warnings she could almost hear. Somewhere in the distance, she imagined the warrior, riding along the ridge, observing, waiting, aware of the danger that now seemed closer than ever. The knowledge that she was caught in a web of judgment, fear, and the unknown pressed down on her. Yet she felt a strange resolve building. She had survived before. She would survive again. But the questions piling against the edges of her life were growing, pressing toward a tipping point she could not yet name. In the late afternoon, the town's preacher arrived at her door. His approach was quieter than the sheriff's, but no less imposing. He carried the weight of moral authority in every step, and when he spoke, his voice was both gentle and firm. "You must think carefully," he said. "This path you are on is dangerous, not just for you, but for the people who care, whether you believe it or not. The choices we make ripple outward." She met his eyes steadily. "I know what I am choosing," she replied, "and I will not live in fear of what others think." He sighed, a sound that carried both frustration and reluctant respect. You are stronger than most, but the world outside these walls does not bend to strength alone. There are consequences, and some you may not survive." She nodded, though the unease inside her deepened. He was right, in ways the town could not understand. Choices had consequences, and her connection with the warrior was no longer just a story whispered in the streets. It had become a thread running through a larger tapestry of danger, culture, and unseen forces. And yet, she could not turn away. Something in her told her that to step back now would be to deny herself entirely, to let fear dictate her life as it had for too long. Meanwhile, across the plains, the Apache warrior moved with purpose. He had received word from his people that tensions were rising, that settlements were watching closely, and that alliances could shift with the smallest spark. He understood the stakes, not just for himself, but for her. Every choice he made could endanger her or protect her, and he balanced the weight of that responsibility with the training and instinct that had guided him all his life. There was no room for error, and yet he felt the pull of something stronger than caution, an undeniable connection to the woman who had chosen to see him, to trust him, to allow him to enter her life despite the world around them. She spent the evening preparing a simple meal, her mind restless and alert. She sensed the approaching night as a marker, a boundary beyond which uncertainty became immediate. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, the wind carrying distant sounds that could be the approach of travelers or threats, and she felt the tension coiling in her chest. She knew that the world was larger than the town, that danger and opportunity moved invisibly across the land, and that her choices now could determine everything. Her thoughts turned to the small details of life, the rhythms that had once been predictable, the animals she cared for, the chores she completed, the letters she read. Each had become a reminder of stability she was clinging to, even as forces beyond her control pressed in. And yet, the presence of the warrior loomed in her mind with a power she could neither ignore nor resist. He was a mystery and a certainty at the same time, a force that demanded attention and respect, and she realized that the quiet strength between them was a battleground in itself, one where judgment, fear, and desire all met and tangled. As the night deepened, she heard the faint sound of hooves on the distant ridge. Her heart quickened, a mixture of relief and apprehension rising in equal measure. She moved to the window, trying to steady her breath, and watched as his silhouette appeared against the darkening sky. He dismounted silently, and when he approached her door, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down. There were no words yet, only presence, tension, and unspoken understanding. The conflict had grown larger than the town, larger than her loneliness, larger than the simple labels they had attached to her life. It was a collision of worlds, a convergence of past and present, fear and hope, judgment and freedom. They stood together in the dark, the wind carrying scents of grass, dust, and sage. Neither spoke at first. The silence was thick, charged with possibilities neither could yet name. He studied her, and she studied him, both aware of the dangers surrounding them, both aware of the fragile thread that connected them despite it. The town could wait, the world could wait, but the choices looming over them were immediate and pressing. She felt it in her bones. Nothing about this connection was simple, and every decision would ripple outward in ways she could not yet understand. She moved closer to him, her hand brushing against the edge of his coat, a silent acknowledgement that the tension between them was both real and inevitable. He did not speak, but the tilt of his head and the steady gaze he held was answer enough. Somewhere deep inside, she understood that the coming days would be full of tests of loyalty, courage, and resilience. She did not yet know the form these tests would take, nor the dangers that would rise from both the town and the plains beyond. All she knew was that life had shifted, that judgment and desire had collided, and that the Apache warrior who had chosen her would be at the center of it. The night stretched on, the prairie holding its breath. She closed the door behind them, listening to the faint creak of the hinges, feeling the weight of choices yet to be made pressing in every corner of her mind. Somewhere beyond the horizon, forces stirred, unseen but unmistakable. Whispers of conflict, opportunity, and danger were carried on the wind, a reminder that her life was no longer simple, no longer solitary. And as she stood there, heart racing, she understood that the world had changed forever, and that the path ahead was uncertain, perilous, and entirely hers to navigate. The stars watched silently above, and the prairie waited in shadow and wind. And she knew, with a certainty that sent shivers down her spine, that nothing about tomorrow would be ordinary, that every step would test her, and that the Apache warrior who had chosen her was both her shield and her challenge. The night had fallen heavier than she expected, draping the prairie in a darkness that seemed almost alive. She could feel it pressing close to the house, in the rustle of the grass, in the distant calls of coyotes, in the faint whistle of wind through the fence posts. The Apache warrior had remained by her side for the evening, but neither of them spoke much. Words felt unnecessary. The tension between them was alive, vibrating through the air like a warning, and she could feel the anticipation building in every nerve. Something was coming, she knew, though she could not yet see what form it would take. The town had grown restless over the past days. Whispers that had once been merely cruel now carried urgency, and she could sense the unease in the voices of those passing near her yard. Some came too close, trying to catch glimpses of the warrior, hoping to prove some scandal or to provoke trouble, while others lingered in judgment, eyes sharp and calculating. She knew the town would not wait long before taking action, yet she had grown stronger with him beside her. He had taught her, in silence as much as in words, how to read the subtle signs of danger, how to anticipate movement, and how to make choices that would protect both of them. That evening, as they moved through the small house together, preparing a modest meal, she noticed a change in him. His eyes were sharper, more alert, and his hands rested lightly on the straps of his satchel as if expecting trouble at any moment. The calm she had once felt with him nearby had been replaced by a focused vigilance. She understood that whatever was approaching was not just the whispers of the town but something far larger, something that had always existed on the edge of the plains, waiting for a moment to strike. Her pulse quickened, yet she did not shy away. She knew fear had its place, but courage demanded action. The first sign came as a faint noise on the horizon, the soft but unmistakable rhythm of hooves against the hard earth. She rushed to the window, heart hammering, and saw a group of riders approaching from the distant ridge. They were not townsfolk, she realized immediately. Their movements were too precise, too deliberate. They were mounted and organized, carrying the energy of purpose that could only belong to outsiders, hunters, warriors, or those who meant harm. Her heart sank. The Apache warrior stepped beside her, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his knife, eyes scanning the ridge as he read the approach with the ease of someone who had survived countless battles. "They are coming for us," he said quietly, voice calm but edged with steel. "We have little time." She felt the weight of those words like a stone in her chest. She had prepared for whispers, for judgment, for isolation, but not for this. And yet, the fear was tempered by an undeniable thread of resolve. She was not alone. He was here, and that made all the difference. Together, they moved through the house with precision, gathering what they could, reinforcing doors, checking supplies, and preparing for whatever might come across the ridge. Each sound of the approaching horses tightened the tension, each shadow growing longer and more menacing. The riders came closer, their numbers clearer now, and the woman could see the determination in their posture. They were not here for casual intimidation. There was planning, coordination, and danger in every movement. She glanced at the warrior, whose eyes never left the approaching group. She had never seen such focus, such unflinching attention. She realized then that his calm exterior was only a mask for the readiness that pulsed beneath, a readiness honed by years of survival and by battles fought beyond the reach of her understanding. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. The wind carried scents she could not name, the prairie itself seeming to hold its breath. She caught glimpses of movement through the window, shadows stretching unnaturally as the riders drew closer, and every instinct screamed at her to prepare, to act, to survive. She felt the tension coil around her, a living thing that demanded her attention and her courage. The night was no longer just a backdrop. It was a participant, a force that pressed in from every side. In the house, she and the warrior worked silently, sharing a language of glances and gestures honed through shared understanding. He moved quickly, efficiently, checking every corner while she followed instructions without hesitation. Every sound from outside made her heart race, every shadow caused her breath to hitch. And yet she felt stronger than she had in months, sustained by the presence of someone who would not abandon her, who would face the unknown alongside her. The first rider broke from the group, moving with purpose toward her home. The warrior stepped forward, intercepting him before he reached the fence, knife drawn, eyes burning with unspoken warning. The rider hesitated, measuring, and she saw the shift in posture as he realized he had underestimated the pair within the house. Others followed, testing the boundary, circling the perimeter, probing for weakness. She realized then that this was not just a simple threat. This was an organized attempt to seize, to intimidate, or perhaps to punish. The tension coiled tighter, the suspense unbearable, and she felt the weight of every choice pressing down on her. Inside, she moved with quiet determination, readying what defenses she could. She could hear the horse hooves striking the ground in rhythm, each sound building the anticipation to a near unbearable level. The Apache warrior stood firm, every movement precise, as he directed her with a calm authority that masked the storm of vigilance within him. She watched him, felt her pulse rise, and knew that the coming moments would test both their courage and their trust. The first confrontation occurred at the edge of the fence. The rider lunged forward, attempting to cut through the boundary, and the warrior met him with swift, decisive action. The clash was brief, violent, and precise, leaving the rider dismounted and retreating. She felt a rush of fear and relief, the two emotions tangled in a way that made her chest tight. The other riders reacted instantly, surrounding the perimeter, testing every weakness. The tension escalated as she realized that every second counted, that a single misstep could turn the night into chaos. She thought of the town and its relentless judgment, but the thought was fleeting. There was no time for whispers now. Every sound outside the walls, every shadow in the grass, was immediate and real. The warrior moved with an almost preternatural awareness, intercepting threats before they reached her, guiding her movements with brief gestures and whispered instructions. She followed, heart racing, adrenaline heightening every sense. The world outside the house had transformed from rumor and gossip into danger tangible and immediate. Hours passed in a blur of vigilance. The riders probed, circled, and tested, each attempt more aggressive than the last. The tension in the air was electric, and she could feel it crackling in the space between herself and the warrior. Every brush of his hand against hers, every shared glance, was loaded with unspoken understanding. They were no longer simply survivor and protector. They were a team, bound by circumstance, courage, and an undeniable connection that neither of them fully understood, but both trusted. The night deepened, and the tension escalated to near unbearable heights. The riders had not relented, their strategy deliberate, their numbers and skill a constant reminder of the stakes. She watched from the window as shadows moved across the prairie like predators, every movement calculated, and she felt her pulse tighten with every approach. The warrior stood at her side, steady, unyielding, and yet she could see the strain in his posture, the vigilance that had become almost a second skin. At one point, a rider broke away from the group, attempting a flank. She shouted a warning, her voice cutting across the night, and the warrior responded instantly, intercepting the threat with a swift, precise strike. The rider was driven back, but the tension only intensified. There was no room for error, no pause, no breathing. Every moment was charged, the suspense building to a point that made her stomach twist, made her hands tremble, and made her heart pound like a drum. Through it all, she felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. The danger was real, palpable, and immediate. Yet she also felt alive in a way she had not in years, awakened by the presence of someone who moved beside her with equal courage and determination. The suspense was unbearable, and she understood that the coming moments would define everything: her safety, the warrior's purpose, and the fragile, extraordinary bond that had grown between them. As the night pressed on, she realized that the riders were beginning to test more than her home. They sought to undermine the warrior's strategy, to find a weakness in their coordination, to exploit any lapse. Each movement, each sound, was a potential signal of success or failure, and she felt the tension mounting to a breaking point. She knew that soon the confrontation would come to a head, and the stakes would be higher than they had ever been. In the quiet moments between attacks, she found herself drawn closer to him, her hand brushing against his arm, her breath catching as she realized the depth of her reliance on his presence. He was not just her protector. He was her connection to a life she had not dared to imagine, a life where courage and love could coexist, even in the face of danger. The tension between them was electric, unspoken, yet undeniable, and she felt it in every fiber of her being. The riders regrouped, their strategy shifting, and she realized that the moment of greatest suspense was approaching. The night had stretched long, the prairie had held its breath, and now the air seemed to throng with anticipation. She could hear the distant calls, the low rumble of movement, the brush of hooves against earth, and she understood that the climax of this confrontation was near. Every decision she had made, every step she had taken, every moment of courage and hesitation had led to this point. The warrior placed a steady hand on her shoulder, grounding her, and she met his eyes. There was a silent understanding between them, a knowledge that what came next would test them both, challenge them, and define their future. She felt the suspense coil in her chest like a living thing, sharp, urgent, and inescapable. The night was poised on the edge of a knife, every sound outside a signal, every shadow a threat, every heartbeat a drum calling them to action. She could feel the anticipation tightening, every fiber of her being alert to the approaching danger. The prairie seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with unseen eyes and unspoken threats. The moment of climax was coming, and with it, the resolution of the tension that had built over weeks of whispers, fear, and the unyielding presence of the Apache warrior who had chosen her. She did not yet know the form it would take, nor the outcome, but she felt the charge in the air, the electric suspense that made every sense acute, every thought sharp, every heartbeat an announcement of what was to come. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of smoke and dust, a reminder that the world outside their small house was alive with forces she could neither control nor fully understand. The riders were close, the prairie seemed ready to collapse into action, and she felt the tension peak, a living thing that pressed in from every side. She stood beside the warrior, ready for what would come, aware that every second counted, every choice mattered, and every moment was charged with suspense and possibility. And as the stars shone cold and sharp above the prairie, she knew the climax of their story was only moments away, the world waiting in suspended anticipation, the night alive with danger, and the bonds between them tested like never before. The resolution had not yet come, but the stage was set, the stakes undeniable, and the tension unrelenting, pulling them toward a moment that would define everything. The first light of dawn stretched across the prairie, softening the sharp edges of the night and bringing the world into quiet focus. She stepped outside, her breath visible in the crisp morning air, and saw the aftermath of what had passed. Tracks crisscrossed the ground, broken fences where riders had tested their courage, and the faint smudge of smoke from a small fire they had started as distraction. The tension that had gripped her for so long still hummed faintly in her chest, but the fear that had kept her alert and cautious through the night was gone. It had been replaced with something steadier, a quiet certainty that they had survived, that they were still together, and that the choice to stand by each other had been the right one. The Apache warrior moved beside her, his horse grazing the edge of the yard, calm now that the immediate danger had passed. His eyes, dark and steady, met hers, and in them she saw a reflection of her own relief and resolve. The battle was over, not with the noise of shouting or the clatter of weapons, but with presence, with courage, and with a connection that had grown stronger with every moment of tension. He did not speak immediately. There was no need. Words could not capture the understanding that had formed between them, the unspoken acknowledgment of what they had endured and survived together. She walked along the fence, inspecting the damage and noting what needed repair. Broken boards could be replaced, scorched grass could recover, but the lessons of the night were permanent. The town had tested them. The unknown riders had pressed their limits, and yet here they were, standing together, unbroken. The strength she had discovered in herself and in him was something that could not be undone. The whispers and judgments of the townsfolk no longer carried weight. The world outside their fence had been harsh and uncertain, but they had faced it and emerged stronger, more certain of their choices and of one another. The town, predictably, stirred as news of the night's events spread. Some came cautiously to the edge of her property, peering from a distance, curiosity and awe mingled with lingering suspicion. Others chose to avoid her altogether, realizing that the woman they had once labeled a scandal had survived danger with courage and intelligence that could not be ignored. The Apache warrior's presence had changed everything. He had brought with him a force the town could neither fully understand nor resist, and in that she felt a quiet satisfaction. Respect had replaced judgment, at least in part, and the narrative that had haunted her for so long began to shift toward one of admiration and acknowledgement. Inside the house, she moved with a sense of calm and purpose. She checked on the animals, tended to her chores, and even allowed herself a small smile as she prepared a modest breakfast. The Apache warrior helped with quiet efficiency, a partner in every sense, his presence grounding her in a way she had not known she needed. They did not need to speak of the events that had passed. The shared understanding was enough. Every glance, every gesture, reinforced the bond that had grown under the weight of tension, danger, and shared vigilance. As the day progressed, they began to talk in small, measured ways, sharing fragments of their thoughts and feelings. He spoke of the journey that had brought him here, of the dangers that still existed beyond the town, and of the people he had left behind. She listened with a mixture of curiosity and empathy, realizing that he had carried burdens and responsibilities she could scarcely imagine. Yet there was no heaviness, no despair in his voice. Instead, there was hope, a quiet determination that they could build a life together despite the challenges. She shared pieces of her own story, of the loss she had endured, of the judgment she had faced, and of the quiet resilience she had cultivated in solitude. In their exchange, they found understanding, companionship, and the beginnings of trust that ran deeper than words alone. Outside, the prairie seemed to hold its breath as if acknowledging the resolution of the night's tension. Birds called from the distant trees, the wind moved softly through the grasses, and the sun began to climb, casting long, warm shadows across the land. The world felt renewed, and with it came a sense of possibility. She realized that the Apache warrior's choice had not been about defiance or danger. It had been about recognition of her courage, her strength, and her worth. That acknowledgment carried a weight she had not expected, and it left her both humbled and empowered. The town slowly adjusted to the new reality. Rumors persisted, of course, but they shifted from malicious speculation to cautious respect. People spoke in softer tones, glances lingered with curiosity instead of judgment, and a subtle acknowledgment grew that she was no longer simply the widow of the past or the scandal of gossip. She was a woman who had faced danger, who had endured uncertainty, and who had chosen a path guided by courage and conviction. The Apache warrior beside her was a symbol of that choice, a living testament to strength, partnership, and resilience. In the quiet moments of the afternoon, they walked together along the ridge overlooking the plains. The air was clear, the horizon stretching endlessly, and she felt a sense of peace that had been absent from her life for years. She noticed the details around her, the way the wind carried the scent of sage, the distant movement of wildlife, the soft hum of life continuing beyond their immediate troubles. Every detail grounded her in the present, reminding her that while danger existed, so too did beauty, possibility, and hope. He paused at the edge of the ridge, looking out across the land, and she stood beside him, sensing his quiet reflection. "The world can be harsh," he said softly, "but it can also be fair in ways we do not always expect. We survive, we choose, and we protect what matters. That is enough." She nodded, understanding the weight of his words. The night had tested them, the town had judged them, and the unknown had challenged them. Yet they had endured. They had chosen each other in the face of whispers, danger, and uncertainty, and that choice had become a foundation upon which something lasting could be built. The relief she felt was profound, tempered with awareness that life would continue to bring challenges, but grounded in the knowledge that they could face them together. As they returned to the house, she felt the warmth of the sun on her face and the steady presence of his hand brushing against hers. Inside, the familiar routine of chores and small tasks resumed, but now with a renewed sense of purpose and partnership. They moved in unspoken harmony, a rhythm born of shared experience, trust, and mutual respect. There was laughter in their exchange, quiet smiles, and the occasional teasing remark that lightened the atmosphere. The tension that had defined the previous nights had been replaced with a calm certainty, a feeling that while the world could be unpredictable, they had each other. The town's children, once curious and wary, began to approach the edges of her property with cautious smiles, encouraged by the absence of immediate danger and the newfound respect the adults had shown. She greeted them gently, offering small kindnesses that reinforced her presence as a figure of strength and compassion. The gossip that had once painted her as scandalous began to lose its power. People began to see her for who she was, not the labels they had applied. And with the Apache warrior standing by her side, it became clear that she was no longer alone in the world or in her choices. Evenings took on a new rhythm. They would sit on the porch, sharing stories of past and present, sometimes in silence, sometimes in quiet conversation. She learned more of his life, of his people, of the lessons that had shaped him into a warrior and a protector. He learned more of her experiences, of the grief she had endured, of the strength she had cultivated in solitude. Through these exchanges, they discovered a shared understanding and a deep connection that had been forged in the crucible of tension and danger, but which now flourished in the light of safety and trust. One day, as they walked along the prairie, she turned to him with a question she had held back for weeks. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" He looked out across the horizon, thoughtful, and then back at her with a steady gaze. "Every day," he said, "but the point is not to fear it. It is to face it, together. Whatever comes, we will meet it side by side. That is what matters." She felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, a certainty that had been absent for far too long. She had lived under the weight of judgment, rumor, and grief, and now she was discovering a life defined by courage, choice, and connection. The Apache warrior had chosen her, and in doing so had shown her that strength, love, and trust could coexist even in the harshest of landscapes. The town, the prairie, and the distant horizon all seemed to acknowledge the change in her life, as if the world itself had shifted to recognize the choices she had made. As the days passed, the routines of life returned with a gentle normalcy. Chores were completed, fences repaired, and the animals tended, but the shadow of danger had been replaced with the light of possibility. The whispers of the town no longer carried the same weight. Respect had replaced suspicion, curiosity had replaced judgment, and the presence of the warrior had created a space where courage, love, and life could flourish. She walked with him across the prairie, their hands brushing, their conversation light and easy, the tension of past nights now transformed into a quiet strength. The horizon stretched endlessly before them, promising more challenges, more stories, and more moments of choice. Yet, she felt ready. She had survived loss, endured judgment, faced danger, and discovered courage she had not known existed. And she had done so with someone who valued her strength, shared her risks, and chose her freely. The balance of the world, once precarious and uncertain, now felt steady. As the sun set on the prairie, casting long golden shadows across the land, she stood beside the Apache warrior, watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and purple. The day had been long, filled with the tension of survival, the echoes of conflict, and the quiet satisfaction of enduring together. She felt a profound sense of peace, a certainty that whatever the world held, they would face it as one. The whispers, the danger, and the uncertainty had not disappeared entirely, but they had lost their power to define her. She turned to him, a smile touching her lips, and he returned it with a quiet nod. In that moment, the story of the widow labeled by the town, of the Apache warrior who chose her, and of the world that had tested them both, reached a sense of resolution. Not every question had been asked aloud, not every fear fully confronted, but the essential truth was clear. They had found each other, survived together, and built a foundation strong enough to face whatever came next. And as the stars began to appear in the sky, twinkling over the prairie that had witnessed so much, she felt the weight of the past lift, the tension of the night dissolve, and a warmth of hope settle deep in her heart. She knew that life would continue with its challenges, but now she understood the power of choice, the strength of courage, and the meaning of connection. The Apache warrior had chosen her, and in choosing him, she had chosen herself. Together, they had turned danger into trust, whispers into respect, and uncertainty into possibility. The prairie was quiet now, the wind gentle, the night calm. She leaned against the warrior, feeling the steady rhythm of his presence, and allowed herself to breathe fully, free from the fear that had long defined her days. The town could whisper, the world could challenge, but she had discovered a life defined not by rumor or danger, but by courage, love, and the choice to stand together. The future remained open, bright with possibilities, yet grounded in the profound certainty of survival and partnership. In the end, the widow was no longer defined by the judgment of others. She was defined by strength, resilience, and the courage to embrace life on her terms. And the Apache warrior, steadfast and unwavering, had shown her that choice, trust, and connection could flourish even in the harshest of landscapes. Together, they had faced danger, endured tension, and discovered a bond strong enough to carry them forward. The story closed not with uncertainty or fear, but with hope, love, and the quiet joy of a life reclaimed. As the first night stars shimmered above the prairie, she understood that this was only the beginning. The whispers of the town would fade, the lessons of the past would endure, and the connection they had forged would guide every step forward. The future was theirs, bright, wide, and full of promise. And in that promise, she found a happiness long denied, a peace hard won, and a love chosen freely, unbroken, and enduring. The prairie stretched beyond them, infinite and welcoming, and she knew that together they could face any challenge, endure any storm, and build a life filled with courage, respect, and joy. The widow and the Apache warrior stood side by side, the past behind them, the horizon ahead, and the certainty of a life rebuilt with trust and love guiding them forward.